Welcome to World Building Session 20. Today we are talking about fantasy trees, and we're going to come at this from a couple different angles, particularly what their use is in your world or in your story, and then how they kind of function. I'll start off real quick just kind of talking over some of my trees, the ones that are fairly impactful in my world. This is a place called Hyoku, and it is actually a forest on top of a bluff. And these trees are immense. They're really, really tall. I haven't totally solidified exactly how I want to work on them. I like the idea of their trunks being this kind of writhing gray, brown color and little spots of like blue and turquoise shining out from within them. But the trees here are going to be really tall. I'm going to be playing with some of them today, kind of sketching out some archetypes of those. These is just some quick sketches of what the people there might look like. In the other large forest, I've got this, which is just a sketch, essentially, for the other large forest, which is Tsunauchi. And in there are giant trees, but they're much more like rainforest trees. Big, broad canopies. All of the trees are kind of interlocked with one another. This is supposed to be their kind of version of a world tree, the soul tree. And so it is isolated, but around it, there are just innumerable trees. There is actually an Yggdrasil proxy in my story, though, it's not going to come up. It's on a different continent. So I'm going to be just kind of working on these trees a little bit while I talk about some tree-related things. So in general, I think it's good to start the dissection by talking about what a thing is. In this case, that would be what is a tree. And this might sound like a really silly thing to talk about, but if you've been here for any of my discussions on creatures and whatnot, this will probably seem fairly familiar. The big thing is, once we understand the components of a thing, we're able to more adequately modify and alter it to serve our purposes. And I think this is one of the most enjoyable components of world building in general. So trees, kind of at a basic level, are branches, trunk, root, and a canopy of foliage, whether that's pine needles or something like a juniper, where it's a little bit, fuzzier, but still kind of pine needly, or if it's just a canopy of leaves. When you have these four components, then you can start playing with things and modifying them. Obviously, in these trees here, I've made them much, much, much larger, right? So their canopies are bigger than you might see in other trees somewhere else. But the trunk has been elongated. And other than that, very little has been modified. And that's the thing that is probably the first thing to consider when it comes to building your own trees in your world. And this could extend to science fiction as well, because we'll talk about a little bit later, trees are kind of iconic, which means you can play with the aspects of them that are distinct and play with it in different manners. So in your fantasy world or your science fiction world, think about what the trees are and how you can modify those pieces. I think that's just a really good and easy way to start. But this immediately goes into stuff that spans into both of those realms, which I find really intriguing. Like, why do trees have to have leaves? Can you replace the trees with something like mushrooms? This is something you've probably seen in Dungeons & Dragons, in a lot of role-playing games where you get into something like an Underdark or caves, and there are gigantic mushrooms and lichens and algae and things like that that have taken up the role of trees in the environment. And that is kind of where you get into this idea of what a tree is in the purpose that it serves, right? A tree is a structure. It's used to build things. It's used for animals to hide in. Often they produce fruit. All of those kinds of functions can also be taken. So not just the physical aspects of the tree, but the things that a tree does for us, does for the world. They also produce oxygen, which I'm sure occurred to you as soon as I said that as well. So those things can be replaced in different ways. I've seen this done in a couple science fiction stories really intriguingly, where the planet seems almost Earth-like, but something about the trees is a little bit different. In one story, I remember that the plant life grew extraordinarily fast on the planet. They ate a watermelon and spit the seeds, and then the seeds erupted into these vines that nearly covered the entire planet, destroyed their ship. Really odd little story. In other stories, I've run across trees that basically cannot be cut down. They are almost made of like a metallic type substance, but they are easily burned. And then they become more malleable, almost as if they are made of metal. I've run into arenas in sci fi where trees produce, or something other than trees produce the oxygen. So you can look at your trees either by form or function to start with the modification to really make them serve the purposes of your story. Those are generally the places that I recommend starting. In my story, these trees specifically are rain trees, Rein. And they are special, not just in the fact that they are massive and they create this kind of creepy underworld because they're so densely packed that no sunlight or almost no sunlight reaches the forest floor, but they actually contain the souls of one of the species. The sprites that dwell within their forest are born kind of in tandem with the trees. They're descended from an older mortal race, which is inherently linked to plant life. And over the eons, each of the kind of subdivided components of that race has broken apart to focus on a different form of life in the plant world. The ones that we encounter in the story are pretty much all linked to trees, but there are actually others, affectionately known as twinkles, which are linked to flowers and perennial and even annual plants. The interesting thing that comes from this is that the life cycle of all these creatures is intrinsically linked to the life cycle of the plant that they're linked to. I haven't worked out all the details yet, but the idea is likely that a pair of sprites will conceive, and then instead of carrying the child or the embryo to full term, almost like in marsupials, where the young is born early and then migrates to the pouch, it would be something like that, except they migrate to the tree. So they are taken from the mother and then given to a specific plant that will essentially raise them the rest of the way until they are ready to be born. And this means that in the terms of sprites, they are intrinsically and forever linked to that particular tree. It is called their rain tree. This has a couple interesting effects. It means that there are druidic components to how the sprites live because they're born from a tree. Sometimes they can inherit other components, especially if this is a tree that has been used by someone in the past. Because if somebody dies, then they can't be returned to the tree. Then the tree remains kind of as a soul link to that person. But if their body is not returned and exhumed by the tree, then they cannot be reborn. That's another thing, is that the sprites have the unique ability to be reborn by their trees, which of course is an additional function that I'm giving the trees in my world, right? So you are not limited in connection to form or function. They're just good places to start. And so yes, the trees in my world actually allow for the reincarnation of this particular race. Hypothetically, the same should be possible with all the other varieties of sprites that are linked to different kinds of plants. But the story I'm telling right now doesn't really get into them as much. They don't play as pivotal roles. The world I've built is pretty huge, and so I'm not trying to tell every story at the same time. I feel like that would be incredibly overwhelming. So the story I'm working on right now is primarily about humans. The sprites have kind of waned, but there is another story I would like to tell at some point where the entire continent that the story takes place on right now was originally just one gigantic forest. And when magic was pulled away by the gods, the forest began to slowly die. And that's actually why we have these two gigantic forests in Tsunauchi and Hyoku now that are so separated and yet have very similar magical attributes. They would have originally been linked. There would have been this giant forest that spanned the entire continent, but it's gone now. I like the idea of playing with the ages long past, and trees are a fun way to do that because they endure for so long. So playing around with the idea of like some of these trees are maybe like 10,000 years old, and what does that do? And the people who are linked to them have these extraordinarily long lifespans if the trees that they're linked to are also long-lived trees, and not all trees are. This, of course, is probably going to create some distinctions when I start to really play with things. Probably going to get some subtle prejudice, or maybe gross prejudice in some cases, against those that come from trees that are really long lived or really short lived. It generally is just going to depend on who the majority is in that area. If you are linked to a bristlecone pine, which is one of, if not the oldest living tree on our planet, that is going to have some effects. In a culture where they have chosen to honor that, it's going to be this really distinct, noble thing. But you could also have another culture that valued, birch trees or beech trees or things like aspens and cottonwoods, which are much more short lived. And that realm could really go either way, couldn't it? Where you could have a group that saw them as honorable and noble, or maybe even that saw them as like old and senile. Like, you've been around too long, old man. You don't have, a good touch. You don't have a good hold on reality any longer. So I don't know exactly how all that's going to pan out. Again, I'm going to finish the second novel here in the next couple days, I think. And then after that, I'm going to take a while and just work on world building. There's so much to do. And every chapter I write, I seem to like delve into new things and have new things to explore, and it's exciting. It could be stressful, it could be overwhelming, but what's the fun in that? So I'm choosing to see it as an opportunity to grow and expand things and to play with them further. That seems like it'll be much more advantageous for me in the end. Well, how big are these trees? These guys, I think I talked about in one of the prior sessions. I'm assuming they're going to be close to 600 feet tall, which ought to be fun. That ought to be something crazy to play with. Here in Hyoku, one of the fun things to engage with as well is going to be the area beneath the canopy. Because if you've got these gigantic trees that are packed in really, really, really close to one another, you've got a whole world beneath them that is just totally, that is just totally different than everything above. All right, well, I kind of finished that guy off. I want to take some time now and actually play around with some extensions of things like this. Like, how could you modify and build trees that are a little bit different? So I'm going to jump, kind of do a blank page here. I'm going to start just giving myself some random shapes of trunks and see if we can create some weird trees that might be a little bit more interesting to play with. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to talk about kind of the purpose of trees in your particular world. And I think this is something that is going to be really important to think about at a very base level. And that's, what is the purpose of the trees in your world? In my mind, there are two basic purposes, and I'd love to hear if you have additional. In fact, while we're kind of thinking about that, if you have anything that you have worked on in the past with trees or any intention to work with trees in your stories, let me know below. I would really like to know, is this mostly a fixation of mine, or is this something that has some other places where it's rather important and it comes into your stories too? But I think about this in two basic features. The trees are either building out your world, like they're either making your world more distinct and interesting, or they're serving the story. So let's take a couple minutes and talk about those two topics. And obviously, like everything else in this realm, they could be doing both, right? There's no reason why both can't be simultaneously served, but I like to dissect it individually. So let's talk about building out your world. If you have trees that are interesting, that are different than our world, or even trees that specifically call back to places on Earth or other stories, things like Yggdrasil, the world tree, those are going to create an emotional reaction in people who engage with your world, because they're going to ring true. They're going to indicate certain things about how that world's put together. If your world is pretty akin to ours, and then all of a sudden your characters run into a gigantic tree, that's not normal for their world either. Obviously, it's something that can occur there, because it does, But the fact that it's different than normal makes it a unique thing. And your audience, whether those be players in a campaign of some kind, or readers, or if you're putting on something for a video game, doesn't really matter. They're all going to interpret that in a similar fashion. You are telling something about your world via your tree. This single gigantic tree says something unique and interesting about your world. If you have a world where all of the trees are big, where you've created a story where these gigantic trees or fairly unique trees are just integral to the plot, that is something that needs to be understood. It's something that you're not necessarily saying about your world except for just this is the reality, but it's also very important. They tell something about your world. And so think about your trees and think about what they say about your world, how they can be used as a tool to indicate something interesting. Were they built by the gods? Are they a holdover from an older era like mine kind of are? Those kinds of things give you a lot of power in your storytelling. So try to consider them as you start to build things. Like I mentioned, a lot of the big trees in my world are holdovers from kind of a past era. And I like that idea because it gives me a lot of things to play with. There's a lot of intrigue that comes from magic exists, but why does nobody use it? Well, because at one point, humanity kind of messed up and magic was taken away from them and they don't have the ability to do it anymore. And so the old trees are slowly dying. I'm experimenting with some random shapes here. What happens if we really change things? And, mostly I'm just using this sketching as a time and opportunity to talk about the trees. But just in case you're wondering, what is he making there? I'm just trying to really shift some of these ideas. I would encourage you to do the same, to just draw some random shapes and see, can I turn that into a tree? Is that still read as a tree? Does it make sense? If I have a lot of time, I'll go on and do mushroom trees and stuff, but, maybe that'll be something you do on your free time. So, but yeah, I like that idea of the vanished past, as Tolkien calls it. And that's something that I kind of incorporate with my world. But the characters in general, the main characters, especially those who are youthful and kind of serve as our point of view characters, they are from an area not particularly dissimilar to Mongolia. It's an area of plains that has some trees, but not a lot of trees. And there's not a lot there that's particularly strange from our world. And so when those characters come to one of these forests, they actually encounter both of them in the first novel. They are wondrous and scary because they're so different from what their world is. You have entire ecosystems that are different than what they've been exposed to in their life. And so for me, the biggest thing really to communicate with the trees was a sense of mystery and wonder. Part of the reason that I enjoy fantasy, and part of the reason you probably do as well, is you can do things in fantasy works that you can't do in reality. It's fantastic. They're exciting, strange things that can happen that don't happen in our world. It's part of the reason I enjoy the medium, part of the reason I engage with it. And so having the characters who are presumably not terribly dissimilar to us, which again is why Sam and Frodo and the hobbits are our prospective characters in The Lord of the Rings. They're the closest thing to a normal human being in that story, ironically. When those characters arrive in fantastic locations, we as the audience get to feel a little bit of that with them. And that makes it feel exciting and interesting and new. When they get to Fangorn Forest in Lord of the Rings, or to Caras Galadon and they see Lothlorien, those moments are ridiculously exciting and interesting because we feel like we're perceiving them the same way that the characters are. And so for me, that's pretty much the biggest reason why I've done what I've done with forests and with trees in general, is just to make the world bigger, make the world more interesting, make the world feel larger. So that's part of it. That's kind of the aspect of building out the world that my trees are serving. Sometimes it's just a matter of having an exciting tree. Something that is a one-of-a-kind thing, and this can happen with any feature, really. But when you have something that is so terribly different from all the others that are like it, you get this same kind of feature. It builds out your world in an exciting way. It either says something about your world specific, or it just indicates how different your world is from our world or from other fantasy or science fiction worlds. But the other aspect that I talked about is probably more important, and that is serving your story. So think about what happens where those trees are, or those tree-like things. What purpose in your story do those trees need to serve, or can they serve? If by having giant trees you can have a stressful battle because your characters are really high above the ground, that could be enough of a reason to include interesting trees. If your story says something about climate change, about the state of the world, about industrialization, trees can achieve a lot of that. A lot of the reason we get the focus on trees in Tolkien's work is that exact reason. He was unhappy with the mechanized nature of warfare, with the losing of these rural spaces. He feared industrialization. If they are simply a landscape piece, that they are a destination for your characters, that can be totally relevant as well. It doesn't need to be super, super complicated. But when you're building out the trees for your story, think about the purpose that they serve or could serve. And sometimes, they start as, this is an exciting thing to draw, I just want to draw it. And then they become something that's far more interesting than that. I find that happens with a lot of world building things in general. That they start as, this is just exciting and I'm going to do it. And then eventually they become integral parts of things. So you don't have to think about everything before you do it. But I find that there's often some joy in thinking about it ahead of time, or special joy that comes from thinking about it after the fact and figuring out how to incorporate those things. I'm going to have a lot of fun building out all of these forests and building out all of these trees. It's going to give me an excuse to engage in my world more, to learn more about trees, to get out this summer and draw more trees, watch them move in the wind and see how they work. At some point, these trees are not just going to be trees anymore for me. I'm going to start working on building out my world's equivalent of Ents, of tree people. And for that, I am very excited. I know I've gotten some comments here on the channel about the races in my world, and the characters, and how they interact, and what are some of the features of them. And I will get to those things eventually. To be 100% honest, those kinds of things are a little bit more out of my comfort zone. And while I think it's important for artists to get out of their comfort zone, there is a different role that you play when you are acting in an instructional manner. I am of two minds. There is a piece of that which would be beneficial to show anyone who is listening or watching that although I may be proficient at some things, I am not proficient at characters. I am not particularly good at drawing them. And that's good for people to see and to learn. The other part of my mind on the matter is I don't want to waste people's time. If I have advice to give about things, I want to make sure that at least I feel as if it's purposeful for those who are listening. So I will get to characters eventually, but I am going to put in some more practice before I do so. I want to make sure that if you are choosing to spend 15, 20, 30 minutes with me listening to my rambles about world building or ink drawing or whatever, that time is justified. So if that is something you're interested in, I just ask that you be patient. I will get to it eventually. You can see the remnants, not remnants, you can see the start of those things over here. I still have not really insecurity, but I lack confidence when it comes to working on characters. I've put far more of my time and energy into other things. And the day is coming when I will put my trees and robots and stuff to the side for a time and go back to working on characters. Because at the end of the day, Any story you're trying to tell, any world you're trying to build is only as important as the characters, the people, the creatures that are in it, and how they interact with it. If you build a world that nothing ever engages in, it's probably going to be lacking something. And maybe there's an example of this that I am missing, but I think one of the most enjoyable things is building that world and then placing things in it, especially if you have the ability to place them in it without your commands, and you can just see how they interact and how they react to the things that you've created. It's really exciting. Tolkien, the grandfather perhaps of world building, notoriously designed languages first because that was his first love when it came to the craft. And then he decided, well, I've got to have a world to put these people in. So he devised the world that would yield such a language. And then from there, he decided eventually, well, I guess I got to tell a story from here. And we get The Hobbit. And then we get the subsequent stories and everything that comes after that. But your story, your world, is probably going to be best served by the characters that you put into it, the creatures that you put into it. So think about your trees and how each of those things can impact that, what they can do for that story. And if you have anything specific you want me to talk about world building wise, please share below, because I read every comment. I love hearing from y'all. And I just like to make sure that what I'm doing actually ties into what is beneficial to all of you. Well, as always, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing the time and spending it with me. Thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out my Patreon, you can do so at the link below. It gives you access to some features like voting on upcoming content and seeing scripts ahead of time, and sometimes there are even videos that are exclusive for the patrons. But mostly it gives you the ability to support what I'm doing here, and that is much appreciated. The couple dollars here and there help buy new sketchbooks, help make sure that I don't break everything or use up all the ink in my brushes and my pens. So it is very much appreciated. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.